Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show where we slice through the noise and get to the core of complex topics.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're plunging into a subject that often gets painted with a single broad stroke, the Russian pogroms. When most of us hear pogrom, a term itself of Russian origin, we immediately conjure a simple, singular image of anti-Jewish violence in Tsarist Russia.
That's the common picture, definitely.
But what if I told you that this widely accepted image barely scratches the surface, that beneath it lies a deep, often misunderstood complexity of causes, motivations, and varied impacts?
That's precisely what we aim to uncover today. The popular imagination tends to flatten these events into a monolithic, often oversimplified, government-organized phenomenon.
Right, like it was all centrally planned from the top down.
Exactly. And our mission today is to unpack the reality. We're going to explore the phenomenon of anti-Jewish violence in modern Russian history, primarily focusing on three major waves. The late 19th century, from 1881 to 1884.
Okay.
The early 20th century, specifically 1903 to 1906.
Got it.
And then the chaotic, truly devastating period of the Russian Civil War, 1919 to 1921.
So this isn't just a chronological account for you, the curious learner, it's an analytical journey. We're going beyond those popular myths to truly understand the diverse, often shifting causes, the complicated motivations of various actors,
All the different groups involved.
and the devastating widespread impacts of these events. We also want to reveal the nuanced, sometimes contradictory roles played by everyone involved, from the Tsarist government itself to revolutionary groups and even to ordinary citizens caught in the maelstrom.
It's about getting to the what, why, and most importantly, the so what, for how societies can unravel under pressure. It's a complex web.
Let's unpack this.
Setting the stage in early waves, pre-1881 and 1881-1884.
All right, before we dive into the immense waves of violence, we absolutely need to set the historical stage. And that means understanding the so-called Jewish question in Imperial Russia before these mass outbreaks.
Absolutely crucial context.
When we talk about Russian Jewry, we're talking about a significant population, nearly half the world's Jewish population at the time. It's a huge number.
Staggering, really. And critically, they were concentrated within a specific area known as the Pale of Settlement, a region in the western part of the Russian Empire where permanent Jewish residence was historically permitted.
Right, they were legally restricted to this zone.
Exactly. This confinement began way back in the late 18th century, largely as a way for the Russian state to control and contain the newly acquired Jewish populations from the partitions of Poland. They didn't quite know what to do with them.
So it wasn't a choice, it was a policy of containment.
Pretty much. And by 1897, our sources say about 94% of the Jewish population was still confined to this area. A tiny percentage, mostly privileged merchants or skilled artisans, managed to live outside the Pale.
Like in St. Petersburg or Moscow.
Yeah, but often illegally or needing special permits. For the vast majority, the Pale was their constricted world. And within that world, economic conditions were steadily worsening.
How so? What was driving that?
Well, particularly after the 1861 peasant emancipation, which really altered traditional economic relationships, and also the rapid construction of Russia's railroad network.
The railroads bypassed many Jewish towns, right? Disrupting trade.
Precisely. It cut off traditional trade routes, hitting local economies hard.
And it seems the state wasn't exactly helping, often trying to push Jews into what they considered productive occupations like handicrafts and agriculture.
Yeah, there was this official push towards agriculture. But there's a real painful irony here, isn't there?
Tell me about it.
They allocated significant funds for these agricultural colonies, often funded by special taxes collected from Jews themselves.
So Jews were paying for their own supposed integration.
Right. Only for these efforts to largely fail. Due to various factors, really poor land quality, lack of proper training, resources, and frankly, lingering prejudice.
And the failure then gets twisted.
Exactly. It bizarrely reinforced existing negative stereotypes about Jews being inherently incapable of manual labor. So they were condemned for the very failures of state policy.
That's deeply unfair. And it feeds into this wider sentiment, doesn't it?
Precisely. And this gets to the heart of a pervasive, often unfounded anti-Jewish sentiment. Even though Jews played a crucial role in the state-sanctioned alcohol trade, a trade the state controlled and profited massively from, they were widely blamed for peasant impoverishment and intoxication.
Classic scapegoat.
The classic scapegoat. It was convenient, detached from the reality of their own economic struggles, and underscored a deeply rooted prejudice. The official government view, which you see consistently, was that Jews were badly in need of reform, essentially framing Jewish life itself as the problem, rather than the restrictive conditions imposed upon them.
They even tried other ways to force integration, like imposing military service back in 1827 under Nicholas I. What was the thinking there?
Well, the idea was to have Jewish townsmen serve alongside Christians, hoping it would lead to assimilation, maybe even conversion. But the terms were brutal, 25 years long.
25 years.
Yeah. And it was incredibly difficult for observant Jews to practice their faith. There were even quasi-official efforts to convert them. So naturally, this just led to widespread evasion among Jews.
People would flee.
They would. And then the state imposed collective punishment on whole communities when young men ran off. This sparked bitter, often acrimonious debates about Jewish patriotism. Were Jews truly loyal subjects? Or did their unique religious and communal structures make full integration impossible in the eyes of the state?
It sounds like a completely impossible situation, a real no-win.
It really was. And their approach to education was equally contradictory. Traditional Jewish schools, the Heder and the Yeshiva.
The primary school and the advanced academy.
Exactly. They were seen by the government as breeding grounds of Jewish isolation and fanaticism. So the state sponsored its own Jewish schools, explicitly designed to secularize and modernize Jewish children.
How successful were those?
Well, often they had limited success in their stated goals. Many historians have dismissed them as failures due to low enrollment and resistance from traditional communities. But, recent scholarship suggests they did connect a generation of Jewish intellectuals to secular education, even if it was under duress.
So a complex outcome.
Very. It highlights the complex, often contradictory pressures on Jewish life. Even supposed reforms often serve to highlight the Jewish problem from the government's perspective, fueling this sense of disillusionment with past measures. And that ultimately set the stage for new, often more repressive policies down the line.
Okay, so we have this deeply troubled backdrop. Rising tensions, economic hardship, pervasive state-endorsed anti-Jewish sentiment. But before the really massive waves of violence that grabbed international headlines, there were precursors, weren't there? Particularly in Odessa.
Yes, the Odessa pogroms of 1821, 1859, and 1871 are significant. These earlier outbreaks, especially the one in 1871, weren't just isolated incidents. They really laid down a chilling template.
How so? What pattern did they set?
They revealed how easily rumors and, crucially, official indifference could ignite violence, a pattern that would tragically repeat on a far grander scale later on.
And these were mostly urban riots.
Primarily urban, yes.
Yeah.
And often occurring during Holy Week.
Which was already a volatile time.
Exactly. Notorious for drunkenness, heightened religious fervor, and, frankly, related violence across the Russian Empire. In 1821, for instance, the spark was an accusation, likely false, that Jews in Constantinople had aided Turks in killing the Greek patriarch. This led Greeks in Odessa to attack local Jews.
Wow. In 1859.
More rumors. Ritual murder, the age-old blood libel claiming a Christian child had been tortured by Jews. Also false claims of Jews hurling insults at Christians during Holy Thursday rituals. That triggered violence. Interestingly, the crowd reportedly tried in a twisted way to distinguish between good and bad Jews, allowing some to escape.
A chilling distinction. And 1871, just a decade before the big wave, sounds eerily similar.
It really does. Again, Holy Week disturbances. Again, fueled by persistent rumors, Jews insulting Christians, torturing a young Christian, even desecrating a cross on a Greek church gate.
And here's a detail that keeps coming up. The claim that an imperial decree permitted violence against Jews for 3 days.
Yes. That rumor resurfaced repeatedly. It had popped up in 1859, too. This idea of the Tsar's implicit permission, whether real or imagined, was incredibly potent. It gave a kind of twisted legitimacy to the violence in the minds of the perpetrators.
So this wasn't just random rioting. There was this undercurrent of supposed official sanction.
Exactly. Officially, these events were downplayed, designated as mere disorders, besporiadki, a term that subtly minimized their horror and the underlying anti-Semitism. Initially, believe it or not, the Russian intelligentsia held on to a surprising optimism.
Really? After these events?
Yeah, they thought such medieval religious intolerance would simply disappear with the great reforms of the 1860s. They believed modern society would just naturally move past such barbarity.
But that optimism didn't last, did it?
No, it changed. By the 1870s, as reforms failed to solve Russia's deep-seated problems and political terrorism began to emerge, the mood soured. The press reflected this shift from optimism to, well, despair.
How did the press cover it?
It varied.
Yeah.
The local Odessa paper, Odesky Vesnik, tried to minimize things, preserve the city's honor, avoid panic. But the big papers in Moscow and St. Petersburg, like Moskovsky Vedomosti, Golos, and Kivlanin, were more critical of official inaction.
And they started framing it differently.
They did. They began framing the issue not just as religious intolerance, but in terms of Jewish exploitation, linking it to alleged Jewish economic dominance, even claiming Jewish religious precepts justified such behavior.
So blaming the victims again.
Pretty much. This reveals a growing politics of despair around the Jewish question. It transformed it from what was seen as a local nuisance into a national crisis. Newspapers started articulating ideas of Jewish economic domination, describing them as a cooperative of kulaks, rural exploiters who sucked the life out of the population.
That's incredibly inflammatory rhetoric.
It absolutely was, and it created a fertile ground, almost a permission structure, for the much larger violence that would follow.
And follow it did. The first great wave of pogroms, 1881 to 1884, was massive, affecting hundreds of communities. What was the direct trigger for this?
The assassination of the Tsar Alexander II on March 1st, 1881. This event plunged the government into utter confusion and became a critical causal pattern for the pogroms that erupted shortly after.
How did the assassination lead to attacks on Jews?
Rumors spread like wildfire across the provinces, falsely linking Jews to the regicide. People claimed the new Tsar, Alexander III, permitted or even ordered revenge on the exploiters who had supposedly killed his father.
That same deadly rumor again.
Exactly. And these pogroms were often characterized by their spontaneous and confused character.
Yeah.
They frequently lacked clear, long-term objectives beyond immediate destruction and looting.
Where did they mainly occur? Cities? Villages?
Both, actually. While the initial outbreaks and the spread were often urban, impacting city centers, they quickly encompassed village taverns, shtetlik, the small Jewish towns, and even agricultural colonies. Interestingly, a significant majority, 219 out of 259 recorded pogroms, actually occurred in villages.
And who were the participants, typically?
Often peasants, artisans, unemployed laborers, vagrants, the dispossessed, sometimes called the Barefoot Brigade, drawn into the chaos.
So economic motives played a significant role here.
Huge. There was this deep, simmering resentment of Jews as employers, moneylenders, suppliers, often exaggerated, but rooted in genuine hardship and changing economic structures.
Plus competition.
Absolutely. Fierce competition from new Jewish businesses, new stores, workshops. Even visible signs of Jewish success, like nicer homes, could fuel resentment among Christian competitors who felt economically threatened. This often led to passive acceptance or even active approval of the violence from better-off Christians.
And that persistent rumor of the Tsar's decree allowing attacks just kept circulating.
It was rampant and incredibly effective. It gave that twisted legitimacy, making people feel they were acting on behalf of the state, punishing the enemies who exploited them and killed the Tsar.
How did the government actually respond to this catastrophe?
Well, initially they blamed revolutionary socialists. This reflected their own paranoia after the assassination. They were jumpy.
But that view changed.
It did, around August 1881, under the new Minister of the Interior, N.P. Ignatieff. He was heavily influenced by the Judeophobe press and, frankly, eager to divert blame from the state itself. So he began to focus on Jewish exploitation as the primary cause of the unrest.
Effectively blaming the victims on an official level.
Precisely, absolving the state of responsibility.
And what about preventative measures? Did they try to stop the riots?
It was inconsistent, to put it mildly. There were vague orders to prevent disorders. In some places, like Elizabethgrad, where the first pogrom happened, or Kyiv, there were genuine efforts to stop the rioting, sometimes using the military.
But these efforts were often hampered.
Yeah, by logistical problems, sheer incompetence of local officials, and sometimes deep-seated anti-Semitism among those very officials who might have privately sympathized with the rioters.
Were there other measures taken?
Yes, though their effectiveness varied. You had official admonitions from clergy, noblemen, Zemstvo members, the local government figures urging calm. K.P. Pobedonosov, a very powerful figure in the Orthodox Church and close advisor to the Tsar.
The Ober-Procurator.
That's him. He sent a circular letter to clergy in the Pale urging them to deter attacks. Authorities arrested some rumor mongers, removed inciting posters. Troops were used to disperse crowds, sometimes with floggings, even though that was technically illegal after 1864 reforms.
So some attempts at control.
Some attempts. Officials posted proclamations saying the Tsar's decree rumor was false. In September 1881, a law allowed extraordinary measures, like military courts, ostensibly to restore order.
But here's the crucial paradox, isn't it? Despite potential severe penalties like prison or exile, the sentences actually handed down were often lenient.
Shockingly lenient in many cases. And this suggested a de facto government stance. It implied that Jews perhaps bore some responsibility for the violence, or that the violence against them was somehow understandable, even if regrettable.
So it sent a very mixed, dangerous message.
Absolutely. On one hand, the state claimed to be restoring order. On the other, it wasn't strongly condemning the reason for the disorder, implicitly validating the anti-Semitic grievances that fueled it.
Now, how did the revolutionary groups react to all this? It must have been complicated for them.
Fascinatingly complicated. Take Narodnaya Volia, People's Will, the group that actually assassinated Alexander II.
What was their take?
Initially, they viewed the pogroms almost favorably. They saw it, quite naively, as the beginning of a popular revolution, the Russian people finally awakening.
They thought the violence would turn against the government.
Exactly. They believed the riots would shift from Jews to landlords and the Tsarist regime itself. And really problematically, they even echoed anti-Semitic stereotypes, calling Jews Zid, the exploiter term, trying to align with perceived peasant grievances to win popular support.
Wow. But their rivals, Cherny Peredal, Black Repartition, had a different response.
Much more complex and frankly contradictory. Some within this socialist group initially shared that view pogroms as popular awakening, even sharing some anti-Jewish economic prejudices, seeing Jews as kulaks.
And not all of them.
No. Others, crucially including Jewish members like a man named Grinfest, challenged this simplistic view. They started asking tough questions. Why were Jewish artisans and the Jewish poor being targeted if this was truly about class struggle?
Good question.
Right. They began articulating a call for workers of all religions to unite against common enemies, arguing powerfully that Jews were also victims of the oppressive regime. This highlights significant internal debates and a real struggle with anti-Semitism within the revolutionary movement itself.
So they were caught in a bind.
Totally. It demonstrates the profound dilemma of, you could call it, cosmopolitan socialism. In a deeply anti-Semitic society, revolutionaries faced practical difficulties condemning pogroms because of widespread popular anti-Semitism. They didn't want to alienate the Narod, the very people they needed to mobilize.
So they sometimes held back from full condemnation.
It led to a significant ambiguity and internal confusion. It made it incredibly difficult for them to fully denounce anti-Jewish violence, even when they recognized its devastating impact on the Jewish poor. They were caught between their ideals of worker solidarity and the perceived need to align with popular, deeply ingrained anti-Semitic sentiment. It was a moral tightrope walk, and often the Jewish victims fell.
Now, let's shift focus slightly to Russian Poland during the same period, 1881-1885. This is interesting because there's this persistent historical suggestion, almost a conspiracy theory, that Russia might have secretly organized pogroms there.
Yeah, the idea being to prevent Polish-Jewish solidarity, right? Especially after the Polish uprising in 1863. Keep them fighting each other instead of the Tsar.
Exactly. But what does the evidence actually show?
Well, the archival evidence paints a very different picture. There are apparently masses of documents indicating the Tsarist administration in Poland. The Kongresauka actively tried to prevent anti-Jewish violence.
Really? Like what kind of documents?
We see circulars from St. Petersburg, like one from Minister of Internal Affairs Loris Melikov, explicitly empowering governors to use all measures necessary, including the army, to prevent disorders. Their primary concern, especially in a historically restless region like Poland, was stability and control above all else.
So they took concrete steps.
Seems so. Governor Miedem of Warsaw sent telegrams, even made personal visits to places like Zyrardo to quickly quash minor disturbances and warn locals of severe consequences if violence broke out. Officials traveled around to read a lesson in civics, basically warning both Jews to be restrained and Christians not to engage in violence.
Did they clamp down on incitement?
Yes. Crucially, actions were taken against priests who were stirring up anti-Jewish sentiment. For example, Governor General Gurko ordered an investigation into a priest in Radzymin district in 1884 for inciting his congregation. This wasn't about sympathy for Jews. It was about maintaining the Tsar's order and authority.
So specific procedures were put in place.
Yeah, like increased police surveillance during Easter, which they knew from experience was a likely time for riots.
But what about that conspiracy theory? That they organized it secretly and destroyed the evidence?
Well, the key point here is the absence of documentary evidence for direct organization versus the presence of overwhelming evidence showing attempts to prevent and suppress violence.
So the bureaucratic instinct was to maintain order, not orchestrate chaos.
Exactly. Even with puzzling incidents like the police's slow response during the 1881 Warsaw pogrom triggered by a false fire alarm, there's no conclusive proof of official orchestration. The bulk of the evidence points towards efforts by the Tsarist administration in Poland to prevent and suppress pogroms. It highlights the fundamental difference between a desire for bureaucratic order and active complicity in inciting violence.
So even if individual officials were biased.
Right. Even if they held private prejudices, the documents suggest the administration as a whole did what it could to keep tensions from exploding. The political differences between Poland and the Pale didn't seem to make pogroms any more attractive an option for the officials there. Order was paramount.
The turn of the century and escalation, 1903-1906.
Okay, let's fast forward now to the turn of the 20th century. Russia is described as being on a collision course with modernity.
Yeah, the historian Pavel Milyukov famously called it two Russias. One was this future-oriented liberal vision for a modern constitutional state.
And the other?
An entrenched, anachronistic bureaucracy desperately clinging to autocratic power. It was a period of profound, escalating discontent across the board.
What kind of strains are we talking about?
Deepening social, economic, political strains tearing the empire apart. You had rural discontent still festering long after the 1861 emancipation. You had the disruptive, often brutal impact of industrial capitalism creating new inequalities. Peasants felt increasingly abused. Labor violence was escalating in the cities.
And all this weakened the state's control.
Absolutely. It led to a general weakening of state control's immense instability. And in this volatile environment, Jews became particularly vulnerable.
Why disproportionately targeted?
They were easily cast as a perceived internal enemy, especially as that terrible cry, "Beat the Yids, save Russia," became a twisted political loyalty test for the empire's most conservative elements.
And the scale of violence, it escalated dramatically in this period.
Horrifyingly so. It marks a catastrophic escalation. From scores of victims in 1881-82, we're now talking about thousands of fatalities in 1905-06.
Thousands?
Yeah. That's a drastic, qualitative leap in brutality and destruction. It really reflects a wholesale governmental collapse in its ability, or perhaps even its willingness, to protect its own citizens.
Where does this horrifying escalation really begin?
Many point to Kishinev in 1903. It was a truly shocking display that drew widespread international condemnation.
What was the situation in Kishinev?
It had a very large Jewish population, about 50,000 out of 147,000 residents, roughly a third of the city. And there were deep-seated anti-Semitic feelings among its non-Jewish residents, which were actively inflamed by local actors.
Like the press?
Exactly. The local anti-Semitic newspaper, Besarabets, played a direct instigating role. It openly encouraged violence with slogans like "Death to the Jews" in the days leading right up to the pogrom.
And what was the specific spark that set it off?
A classic, deeply entrenched anti-Semitic canard. The mysterious disappearance and alleged ritual murder of a Christian boy, Mikhail Rybachenko, right near Passover.
The blood libel again.
Yes. Even though authorities consulted physicians who found no evidence of ritual murder and explicitly dismissed the rumors, the incitement continued relentlessly, fanning the flames of ancient prejudice.
Who participated in the violence?
Estimates put the crowd at its peak around 1,500 to 2,000. Predominantly Moldavian men, the publisher of Besarabets was Moldavian, but Russians and Albanians were also mentioned. It suggests a fairly broad base of participation.
And their motivations.
Multi-layered. You had the direct incitement from Besarabets. You had that recurring, powerful rumor of the Tsar's permission to beat and rob Jews, that false decree from 1881 making a chilling reappearance. And the growing, often unfounded, association of Jews with radical politics.
Was there a religious element too? It happened around Easter.
Abundantly interwoven. The pogrom began on Easter Sunday, right after church services. Questions were rightly raised. Were parishioners reminded that Jews were killers of Christ? And the documentation mentions horrific details like spikes being driven through victims' hands, legs, heads, raising the horrifying question of whether this was seen as some kind of ritualized retribution for the crucifixion.
And the official response, what did the authorities do?
It was marked by irresponsibility, dereliction, and mismanagement. Local officials, especially Governor von Raben and Chief of Police Chesminkov, simply took no immediate action. They allowed the violence to escalate unchecked for days.
Was there suspicion of higher-level involvement?
Strong allegations, yes. That the Minister of the Interior, Klier, a powerful Tsarist figure, knew about it in advance and actually instructed Governor von Raben not to use arms against the rioters. Klier denied it, of course, but it points to a chilling level of deliberate inaction, at the very least.
In the government's official line.
The official viewpoint, often repeated by Nicholas II himself, was basically that the Jews brought it on themselves. The narrative was that Jews were parasitic elements, living off the hard work of the Narod, and secretly conspiring in revolutionary groups to overthrow the Tsar. Neither assessment was remotely accurate. Jews in the Pale were often incredibly poor, and only a tiny percentage were involved in radical activity.
But this official stance effectively condoned the violence.
It amounted to a de facto non-condemnation, a subtle but incredibly powerful signal that implicitly encouraged future pogroms by showing that such violence wouldn't be met with the full force of the state. It basically blamed the victims.
And just 5 months after Kishinev, Gomel followed a similar pattern.
Yes, Gomel in 1903, over half its 40,000 residents were Jewish. It experienced a similarly dramatic pogrom, again arising from accusations of revenge and rationalized by claims of Jewish responsibility for social ills. It was a terrifying echo of Kishinev, reinforcing this emerging template for violence.
And the government's attitude in the aftermath? Especially the trials.
Egregious. Despite clear evidence of widespread violence, sentences for the Gomel pogromists were shockingly lenient. For Kishinev, the harshest was 5 years penal servitude for 2 men. For Gomel, 12 non-Jews, and get this, 18 Jews arrested for self-defense got up to a year, and sentences were often commuted or pardoned.
And no officials were held accountable.
Crucially, no police, reservists, military, or government officials were charged with criminal activity for their inaction or complicity. The respected law journal Prabo summed it up powerfully. Who then is the real author of all the horrors? Besides the Christians and the Jews, there is still another, the government.
Wow. That explicitly points the finger at the state's culpability.
It does, not necessarily through direct organization, but through inaction, tacit approval, and that willingness to blame the victims.
Then came the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. How did that impact the situation?
Russia's disastrous, humiliating performance in the war further deepened domestic discontent. The war was meant to diffuse anti-government sentiment, rally the nation.
But it backfired.
Catastrophically. As conscripts became reluctant to fight and reports of defeats mounted, anti-government protests intensified, and this led to something new. The mobilization pogroms.
Mobilization pogroms. How did that work?
Anti-Semitic newspapers and pamphlets seized on the discontent. They fabricated stories claiming Jews collaborated with the Japanese, supplied them with funds and munitions, deserted the front lines.
More scapegoating.
Exactly. This fanned the flames of resentment, making Jews a convenient target for frustrated reservists waiting for deployment, furious about being conscripted into a losing war. One vile pamphlet even hinted at genocide. Kill them, no quarter, every single one is. The message was horrifyingly clear.
Where did these happen?
24 mobilization pogroms occurred, mostly concentrated in Mogilev province, where many reservists were gathered, and predictably, local authorities often failed to respond adequately, allowing the violence to run its course.
Did anything stop them?
Interestingly, they began to subside when conscription policies changed. The government started drafting younger, single men rather than married men with families, which reduced social unrest. They also mobilized better trained, more disciplined troops, less prone to rioting. The policy change coincided with the end of these specific pogroms.
And this brings us to arguably the most devastating period before the Civil War. 1905. The Revolution and the rise of the Black Hundreds.
Yes. The October Manifesto of 1905, which was the Tsar's attempt to quell unrest by granting civil liberties and a parliament, the Duma.
It didn't work as planned.
It actually intensified political polarization. Society split sharply into pro- and anti-government forces. Jews, understandably, saw the manifesto as a crucial step towards emancipation and equality, and they celebrated eagerly in the streets.
Which unfortunately played into the hands of reactionaries.
Exactly. It reinforced the dangerous perception among conservatives that Jews were deeply involved in revolutionary activity.
And into this volatile atmosphere stepped the right-wing political organizations.
Yes, most prominently, the Russian Assembly and the Union of Russian People, or URP, collectively known as the Black Hundreds.
What characterized them?
They were often directly subsidized by the government, including Nicholas II himself, who saw them as loyal patriots. And they were defined by a deep, vulgar, and violently expressed anti-Semitism. Their rallying cry was simple and terrifying. Beat the Jews.
So they were basically street thugs for the regime.
They became the overt enforcement agents of reactionary politics, using street violence as a tool to suppress dissent and intimidate opponents.
Is there evidence of high-level government involvement with them?
Compelling and deeply troubling evidence. The director of police himself, A.A. Lopukhin, reported in February 1906 that a secret printing press at police headquarters printed thousands of anti-Semitic pamphlets during the peak of the 1905 violence.
At police headquarters?
Yes. The heart of the state apparatus producing hate propaganda. Nicholas II personally intervened to prevent charges against the officer running the press, M.S. Komisarov, and even granted him 25,000 rubles as a reward.
Unbelievable.
General Trepov, a high-ranking official, allegedly held sympathy with the pogrom policy. And the Duma's own official report on the Bialystok pogrom in June 1906 indicated direct collusion between local officials, Tsarist troops, police, and the Black Hundreds.
So it wasn't just incompetence anymore.
It points to a broader, subtle manipulation of events and a deliberate policy of non-condemnation. Whether explicitly ordered or just tacitly encouraged, it led directly to these horrifying pogroms. It was a conscious choice not to protect Jewish citizens.
What was the scale of violence in 1905?
Massive and unprecedented before the Civil War. Over 600 pogroms recorded in 1905 alone. The human toll was devastating. Over 3,100 Jews killed, at least a quarter of them women, 1,500 orphaned children. Entire towns like Kalarash were burned to the ground.
Just utter devastation. Was there any resistance?
Yes, and this is a crucial, often overlooked detail. Jews actively defended themselves in about 34% of these pogroms. Particularly in areas where the Jewish Socialist Party was active, they organized self-defense units and fought back. This marks a significant shift from earlier waves.
Let's look at Odessa again. In October 1905. It seems to be a microcosm of this period.
It really is. We mentioned its history of anti-Jewish violence rooted in economic competition, Greeks displaced by Jews and grain export, manufacturing, banking, and those recurring religious tensions, ritual murder rumors, church desecration accusations.
And the economic situation was particularly bad then.
It exacerbated by severe economic factors and social tensions reaching a breaking point. You had the pervasive myth of Jewish success versus the stark reality of widespread Jewish poverty. 50,000 destitute, 30,000 poverty-stricken out of 140,000 Jews in Odessa.
So the majority were struggling.
Deeply. Economic downturns, crop failures, the disruptions of the Russo-Japanese War hit unskilled day laborers incredibly hard. Many were sleeping in barrels in the port, experiencing deadly hunger, desperate people, easily swayed, prone to violence.
What happened specifically in October 1905?
It unfolded quickly. On the 16th, general strikes, barricades, clashes with police and military, and a disproportionately high number of Jews were arrested, 197 out of 214.
Which fueled the anti-Jewish sentiment.
Absolutely. This visible Jewish participation in revolutionary activities, even though it was a minority, was deliberately amplified by authorities and reactionaries.
And the pogrom itself.
October 19th. You had patriotic marches by monarchy supporters, singing anthems, tearing down revolutionary symbols. The turning point, the immediate trigger, was when shots were fired. We don't know for sure by whom, possibly revolutionaries, possibly Jewish, or student self-defense, killing a boy carrying an icon in the patriotic procession.
And that unleashed the mob.
Instantly, shouts of "Beat the Yids! Death to the Yids!" erupted, signaling the shift from political protest to full-scale anti-Jewish violence.
And the official complicity here was blatant.
Absolutely damning. Police and military often just stood by, failed to intervene. Some even reportedly joined in the looting. There were credible allegations that policemen compiled lists of Jewish-owned stores for pogromists to target, even paid rioters.
Paid them.
That's what was alleged. And City Governor Neidhart and Military Commander Kalbars chillingly blamed Jewish self-defense groups for shooting at police and soldiers, using this as a justification for their own inaction against the pogromists. It truly exemplifies that subtle manipulation of events, allowing the violence to spread.
Were there differences in who participated among the pogromists based on class?
Yes, stark distinctions. Unskilled day laborers, often unemployed and desperate, frequently joined in. They were highly susceptible to those age-old fears and suspicions, feared job displacement, easily manipulated into attacking Jews as the most conspicuous object during economic distress and political chaos.
But skilled workers were less involved.
Significantly less likely to participate. Metal workers, machinists, for example. Reasons include less direct job competition with Jews and, crucially, the strong presence of political organizers, social democrats, but also the Zubatovites.
The police-sponsored unions.
Yeah, that controversial state-sponsored labor movement. Perhaps, ironically, while aiming to co-opt workers, it also sometimes fostered working-class solidarity across ethnic lines, arguing against targeting fellow workers. This really highlights how social composition profoundly influenced who participated in the unrest.
Chaos and mass murder, 1919-1921 Civil War.
The narrative takes an even darker, more horrific turn as we move into the Russian Civil War, 1919 to 1921. The complete collapse of the empire led to unprecedented Jewish vulnerability.
On a scale never before seen, World War I had already ripped Russia apart internally, exacerbated the lack of consensus, the ethnic rivalries, exposed the obsolete Tsarist institutions.
And the war itself directly impacted Jews even before the Civil War.
Immediately and dramatically, military action was concentrated heavily in the Pale of Settlement. This led to forced evacuations, mass displacement, and profound military distrust of Jews. Baseless accusations of spying for the Germans were common. They were caught in the middle, often seen as disloyal by all sides.
But there was that brief moment of hope after the Tsar fell.
Very brief. Jewish emancipation under the provisional government in February 1917. Finally free and equal citizens on paper. But then, tragically, that government was overthrown by the Bolsheviks in October.
And the empire dissolved into civil war.
A brutal, multi-sided civil war. This left Jews extremely vulnerable, caught literally between warring factions, with no central authority capable or willing to protect them.
And new forms of anti-Semitism emerged in this chaos.
Incredibly potent modern strains, most notably the widespread circulation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that infamous fabrication claiming a Jewish global conspiracy.
And the Bolshevik leadership?
The visibility of a few prominent Jews like Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, in the Bolshevik leadership, though they were a tiny fraction of the Jewish population and often distanced from Jewish identity, offered a twisted confirmation for anti-Semites. It dangerously merged old religious and economic anti-Semitism with new political conspiratorial anti-Semitism, the Judeo-Bolshevik myth.
The consequences were devastating.
Horrific beyond imagination. Estimates suggest as many as 250,000 Jews perished in this period, not just killed in riots, but victims of mass murder.
250,000. And the scale and nature of these Civil War pogroms were fundamentally different from earlier waves.
Qualitatively different, yes. Ukraine became the horrific epicenter. Mass murder of Jews took place there, 1919-1920, on a scale surpassed only during the Holocaust.
Why Ukraine specifically?
It was home to the vast majority of Russia's Jews. 1.6 million out of 2.6 million in the former empire lived there. They were incredibly exposed as different armies swept back and forth across the territory.
How did the pogroms change? You mentioned perpetrators.
Right. Unlike earlier waves often driven by civilian mobs, now all armies involved were responsible. Bolshevik forces, Ukrainian nationalists, anarchist peasant bands led by atamans or batki, local warlords, and the anti-Bolshevik white armies.
So soldiers were the main killers.
Killings were mainly by ill-disciplined soldiers from all these groups. Peasants usually participated more in the opportunistic looting that followed the initial violence.
And the location shifted.
Dramatically. From largely urban in the past to mostly villages during the Civil War, as the fighting moved across the countryside, small towns, Städtlich, were devastated.
And the violence became constant.
It became chronic instead of brief outbreaks and ever-present threat. And finally, the ideology underpinning it operated on this pernicious doctrine of collective guilt.
Holding all Jews responsible.
Exactly. Jews were scapegoated as pro-Russian by Ukrainian nationalists, as capitalist exploiters by some socialists and peasant bands, and as pro-Bolshevik by conservatives and the whites. They were damned no matter what side they might have sympathized with or if they just wanted to be left alone.
Let's break down the perpetrators, Simon Petliura and the Ukrainian nationalists.
A complex figure. While Petliura himself ultimately repudiated pogroms, likely due to international pressure and concern for European opinion, and even appointed a Jewish minister for Jewish affairs.
That seems contradictory.
It was. He and many of his followers initially believed Jews were enemies of Ukrainian independence and inherently pro-Bolshevik. His anti-pogrom manifesto only came in August 1919, far too late, and it reflected too little discipline over his troops, who continued committing atrocities regardless.
What about the anarchists? The atamans?
Their pogroms were often described as the most disorganized and bloody. These were essentially roving bands with no central commands, no concern for foreign opinion. Plunder of Jewish property was a key element, driven by greed and sheer chaos.
Any particularly notorious figures?
G. Grigorev stands out, a bloodthirsty adventurer, one such ataman. He specifically denounced Lenin's regime as Jewish-dominated and actively organized pogroms. The methods used by these bands were truly horrific, escalating brutality beyond anything seen before.
Like what?
Mass shooting, bayoneting, hanging, burning entire villages, drowning victims in wells, even live burials, burying people up to their necks and then having horses trample them. A complete breakdown of any moral restraint.
Just nightmarish. And the White Armies, Denikin's forces.
Their pogroms are chillingly described as the most modern, best organized, carried out like military operations, and crucially, most ideologically motivated.
What does most ideologically motivated mean here?
They were largely Cossack affairs, often joined by non-Cossack officers and locals who shared their virulent anti-Semitism. Among white officers, the anti-Semitism wasn't just casual prejudice, it was passionate and pathological.
Rooted in what?
Traditional imperial disdain for Jews, combined with a fervent, almost apocalyptic belief that Jews were solely responsible for all of Russia's miseries. Bolshevism, inflation, the defeat in WWI. They saw Jewish emancipation itself as a symbol of the disliked modernizing forces that had destroyed their traditional Russia.
Did their reports reflect this?
Disturbingly so. Their intelligence reports used language comparable to later Nazi tracts, openly calling for the neutralization of the microbe, the Jews.
And General Denikin himself, what was his stance?
Privately, he apparently deplored pogroms as barbarism. But publicly and ideologically, he held all Jewry responsible for the alleged crimes of Bolshevik-aligned Jews. He believed Bolshevism and Judaism were virtually identical.
So he wouldn't condemn the violence.
He initially refused Jewish requests to issue a clear condemnation, fearing he'd be suspected of having sold out to the Jews and would lose the support of his deeply anti-Semitic officer corps. He only reluctantly relented in October 1919 with a proclamation that was widely ignored or seen as farcical by his own troops.
Did he act on this prejudice?
He even dismissed Jewish officers who had fought bravely alongside him. It shows a chilling level of ideological motivation and complicity through inaction, prioritizing the perceived loyalty of his anti-Semitic forces over protecting Jewish lives.
What about the role of the Orthodox Church in this period?
It played a deeply ingrained role in fostering anti-Semitism. Priests often blamed Jews for Christ's crucifixion, making Easter traditionally dangerous. During the Civil War, many priests explicitly described Bolshevik Russia as a Jewish-created Antichrist.
Were there specific examples?
Father Vostokov established the Brotherhood of the Life-Giving Cross, explicitly to fight Jewish Freemasonry, a popular conspiracy theory. He even proposed a crusade of priests armed with holy icons against Jewish Bolsheviks, further sanctifying the violence in the eyes of believers.
And finally, the Red Army, the Bolsheviks, were they involved too?
It's crucial to acknowledge, yes, the Red Army was also responsible for some anti-Jewish violence. As we said, all armies involved were culpable for atrocities. However, it's notable that Soviet propagandists generally did not play up the anti-Semitic outrages carried out by their enemies.
Why not?
Possibly a strategic choice. As we discussed earlier with the revolutionaries, anti-Semitism wasn't considered good agitational material for winning over the peasants, whom the Bolsheviks needed. Their public messaging focused on class struggle, not ethnic conflict, even if violence occurred on the ground.
Reframing the narrative in broader context.
So after this deep dive, it's abundantly clear we need to reframe the narrative, especially around that common, oversimplified idea that the Tsarist government simply organized pogroms.
Yes, that myth persists, often without nuance in historical works, but as we've seen, the reality is far more complex.
So no direct planning from the top.
There's no documentary evidence for direct, careful planning or orchestration by the central Tsarist government. However, and this is a huge however, the government absolutely bore immense moral responsibility.
How so, if not direct orders?
Through its policies, its deeply ingrained anti-Semitic attitudes, and its consistent actions or lack thereof. We can best describe it not as direct command, but perhaps as an indulgent wink from officials.
An indulgent wink. Explain that.
Officials' lack of sympathy, their negligent incompetence, and sometimes deliberate neglect to intervene decisively created a permissive environment. The refusal to sternly condemn pogroms, especially by Nicholas II and powerful officials like Trepov, indicated a tacit approval. It normalized violence against Jews, making it seem like an acceptable, even understandable outlet for popular grievances.
And this got worse over time.
Definitely. The restraints and rationality that were still somewhat operative after 1881, where there were genuine, if flawed, efforts to restore order, had significantly weakened by 1905.
Why the change?
By 1905, the regime's very survival was at stake during the revolution. This led to much greater, undeniable official complicity as they actively instrumentalized anti-Semitism and groups like the Black Hundreds to divert attention and suppress revolutionary fervor. It was a descent into a much darker form of state-sanctioned, or at least state-tolerated, violence.
So, summarizing the contributing factors broadly, socioeconomic stress is key.
Paramount. The upheaval of emancipation, rapid industrialization, crop failures, war all created widespread hardship. This made large parts of the population susceptible to blaming Jews, offering that easy scapegoat for systemic frustrations.
And rumors and propaganda
Cannot be overstated. The false Tsar's decree, ritual murder lies, the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, anti-Semitic press and right-wing agitators effectively spread these, manipulating genuine suffering for political gain.
plus official failures.
Absolutely. Inadequate police forces, often overwhelmed. The military's reluctance to fire on their own people, the Christian rioters. Individual officials' anti-Semitic sentiments influencing their inaction. Even internal disputes between civil and military authorities created bureaucratic paralysis, hindering effective response.
And the crowd dynamics themselves.
Yeah, we have to acknowledge that too. The obstinacy of crowds. They could be enraged rather than cowed by resistance, sometimes becoming more violent when met with self-defense, tragically escalating brutality. All these factors interacted in a complex, volatile mix.
Now, to really grasp this, it helps to put it in a comparative perspective. How did this compare to anti-Jewish or racial violence elsewhere in the West?
That's crucial. It helps show that popular antagonism toward a feared or despised outgroup could turn violent as easily in a liberal polity professing egalitarian values as under a centralized reactionary regime. This wasn't solely a Russian pathology.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. Look at Germany in 1819, the Hep riots, arguably the first modern pogrom in Central Europe. Triggered by debates over Jewish emancipation, a mix of lower-class social protest and resistance from educated elites fearing loss of privilege. Officials there often failed to suppress it due to popular sentiment, maybe even some tacit sympathy. France, yes. Algiers in 1898. An intense anti-Jewish campaign, interestingly with leftist, anti-capitalist overtones, fueled by Jewish prominence in business and local elections, led to devastating violence, shows how economic grievances could be twisted into ethnic hatred even in supposedly liberal democracies.
And of course, the United States.
Absolutely. The long, tragic history of race riots. From Philadelphia in the 1830s, the New York draft riots in 1863 targeting African Americans and others, to East St. Louis in 1917, Chicago in 1919.
Are there similarities with Russian pogroms?
Striking similarities, both often urban phenomena targeting newcomers or vulnerable groups, both rooted in economic competition and social tensions. Both often triggered by minor incidents or rumors.
And the violence itself.
Mob violence, looting, profound brutality against property and people. Accounts describe savageness surpassing anything that we could have believed men capable of. And like Russia, officials, police, military were often insufficient, showed deliberate neglect, or horrifyingly even participated sometimes. Resistance from victims could also sometimes exacerbate mob rage.
Was there a key difference in the state's response, generally?
Generally, yes. In the West, the state usually showed, or at least professed, a high regard for law and order, and a refusal to countenance violence from below as legitimate, at least compared to Tsarist Russia after 1881, especially by 1905. The state's stated commitment to protection, even if imperfectly applied, was arguably more present and key to Jewish well-being and eventual integration in the West.
Though racial tensions obviously remain deep-seated in the U.S.
Deeply embedded, absolutely. And this comparison also highlights a broader point. In totalitarian regimes, the classic, seemingly spontaneous pogrom often disappears. Why? Because the state jealously reserves the monopoly of violence for itself, preferring to carry out mass violence in a more systematic, centrally planned, bureaucratic manner, like the Holocaust.
So the comparison shows that while the Russian state's complicity or indifference might have been particularly pronounced at times, the underlying human tendencies, scapegoating, blaming the other, mob violence erupting from social stress are tragically not exclusive to any one political system. So we've gone on quite a journey today, unpacking the complex and horrifying waves of violence that swept through Russia, from those initial smaller outbreaks in Odessa to the devastating, ideologically driven mass murders of the Civil War.
It's clear now that the history of Russian pogroms is far more complex than simple government orchestration. It's a confluence of deep-seated anti-Semitism, exacerbated economic anxieties, profound political turmoil, official indifference or active complicity, and the terrifying eruption of popular rage.
Indeed. It challenges us, and you the listener, to look beyond simplistic narratives and truly understand the interplay of these powerful forces, the specific historical context, and the diverse, often contradictory motivations of all the actors involved.
It forces us to critically examine any simplified narratives of historical violence, no matter how convenient or comforting they may seem.
And for you, the listener, understanding the nuances of these historical events offers profound insights into how prejudice, economic stress, and political instability can combine to unleash devastating consequences even today. It's a sobering reminder that these dangerous forces are often latent, waiting for the right conditions to emerge.
Which leads us to a crucial question to ponder, building on everything we've discussed today. Given this persistent human tendency to scapegoat and the volatile nature of social unrest, what responsibilities do individuals, communities, and governments truly bear in preventing such beastliness from recurring, especially when societies face profound transformations or crises?
And, perhaps even more challenging, how can we as informed citizens learn to distinguish between genuine popular grievance, real suffering that needs addressing, and manipulated hatred, cleverly disguised to turn people against each other for political gain?
It's a distinction that can literally mean the difference between peace and profound violence. Something to think about.